Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101 and welcome to the Genesis series. Today we're going to have another interview with Dr. Georgia Purdom over mutations and natural selections. We had a short interview, but it's really insightful. We go into mutations, we talk about natural selection, we talk about whether those things can add new genetic information, and without further ado, let's dive in. All right. We're here with Dr. Georgia Purdom again, this time discussing mutations and natural selection. Uh, Dr. Purdom, could you give a really brief introduction to yourself for others who might not know you or your background?
Sure. So I am the Vice President of Educational Content for Answers in Genesis. I've been here, it'll be 18 years actually, coming up here pretty soon, hard to believe. And I'm a speaker, a writer. I work a lot, like I say, with our educational programs and curriculum. And I have a PhD in molecular genetics from Ohio State University. And so that's my formal training and what I do. And I love to be able to take that science and be able to make it understandable to a large number of people so they can really understand how science confirms God's word.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right, let's jump right in. We got um, some questions here. You got my questions and everything that I sent you, right?
Yes.
All right. All right. I guess we'll start out. What are mutations exactly?
So mutations are basically any change in the DNA. So it can be there's different types of mutations, so to speak, that we talk about that have all these official names, like if it just changes one base, okay, because DNA, I guess I should say, the structure of DNA is made of four different bases or nucleotides: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, and they have a particular way in which they pair with one another because DNA is a double-stranded helix, so it's just like a twisted ladder, basically. And so adenine always binds to thymine, and cytosine always bonds to guanine. They have a hydrogen bonding that occurs in there. And so you could have substitutions where you just, one DNA base is changed, like an adenine gets replaced with a guanine or something like that. You can also have what we call indels, which are insertions or deletions. So where larger pieces of DNA get inserted into the DNA or pieces get chopped out of it, basically. You can have ones that so DNA obviously has the information needed to make the proteins in our body and control when, where, why, how much, under what conditions, all of those things that those proteins are produced. So in the area of the DNA that codes for those proteins, you can have mutations that will basically mess up, so to speak, what the protein is, so that it doesn't have the same amino acids. That's the basic components of proteins. Uh, so that they're different. Okay, so they're not the same. Sometimes they can have a mutation such that the protein isn't made, it's truncated. It's a shortened form of the protein that's made. Those are what they call nonsense mutations. So there's just different forms of mutations, but it's basically any change in the DNA from its regular or normal state.
We'll get more into this in a minute, but even a loss of information would be considered a change. So if it loses genetic information, it's still change, right?
Right, you're changing it from the original information that was there. And we've yeah, so we'll get into more of that later. So I'll let you
Right. Right.
whenever we want
No
to talk
point in
about
going over it again because we're just repeating
it.
ourselves. All right. What is a natural selection? We might as well start. Some people think mutations, natural selection combined, maybe that would make Darwinian evolution happen. We'll get more on that in a second. But what exactly is natural selection? And from the YEC paradigm, is natural selection is something that we can. I mean, YSCs usually believe in natural selection, but what exactly is it?
So, natural selection is basically just that the offspring that certain offspring basically survive better in a given environment and will be able to, because they survive better, they're more likely to produce the offspring for the next generation and pass that information on to them to be able to survive well. So it's kind of like you can think of it as survival of the fittest, at least is the idea of it. And so it can lead to variations within populations of organisms. Natural selection is something observable in the present. And again, this is where it gets distorted with evolution. A lot of times it will be equated with that, like that natural selection and evolution are the same thing, but they're really not. Creationists do believe in natural selection because it is something that we do observe. And so we can see it acting. So my favorite example to use is sort of a hypothetical example, but the idea is that, let's say you have a rabbit population and they have white rabbits and you have brown rabbits and in an area which is extremely snowy for a good portion of the year. The brown rabbits are going to be easier to be prey because they're easier to see, obviously, against a white environment that they live in. So over time, the population will go to having more white rabbits, most likely, because the brown ones are being eaten. And so you just get more white rabbits. And so it's the idea that a population will shift maybe in color or a particular trait that they already possess might become slightly different just because of those types of selection pressures. Now that's a really easy example. Obviously, I always say in genetics, it's always more complicated than that. But that's the basic idea of natural selection.
If it's okay with you, I'm gonna skip to number 4, and then we'll come back to number 3 because then we're
Sure.
gonna spend a few minutes on number 3.
Yeah.
On number 4, question number 4 I had was on natural selection. So since we're already on that subject matter,
Mhm.
does natural selection is it Darwinian evolution or the opposite of it? I believe you answered part of that question because you're right. I've heard a lot of evolutionists do this where they'll synonymously make evolution and natural selection. Sometimes they'll sit there and say natural selection, but they'll say evolution instead, like they're one and the same. And so, but you would see that as would you see that as the opposite of evolution? That it's in, like, for example, like your example where all the brown rabbits died, they're losing that information in that population. Is that correct?
Correct. So natural selection, we have an exhibit here at the Creation Museum that says natural selection is not evolution. Because natural selection, like I said, explained, is something that we observe here in the present, and we can see this happening, for example, with Galapagos finches on the Galapagos Islands, the Darwin finches. We can see those things happening. We see it in lizard populations. We can see those changes, but they're not the kinds of changes that you need for evolution, because evolution is going to require the gain of new structures and new functions to go from one kind of organism to another kind of organism. So, for example, if people believe that dinosaurs evolved into birds, you're going to have to add a lot of stuff, and you're going to have to take away a lot of stuff to be able to get a bird from a dinosaur, so to speak. You're going to have a way to add that genetic information for that to happen. Natural selection doesn't do that. Natural selection is only selecting from what's there, basically. So it's selecting from traits that organisms already possess, so to speak. And two, I think something that's important to understand is that it's selecting the organism as a whole. It cannot select specific traits or specific parts of the DNA, so to speak, because organisms are whole. And so so it might be selecting for something that, again, gives it an advantage in that environment. But remember too, there might be other traits that organism has that aren't helpful or that are hurtful, but it's going to select for those as well. I mean, those are going to come along with it, so to speak. So it's not always just like building and making something new or making a different organism. And people will say, well, if you just give it enough time, right? Because that's always the evolutionist claim, that time is the key. And I always say time is not the key. You can have as much time as you want, but if you do not have a mechanism, you will not go anywhere. So if you don't have a mechanism to gain the information you need. So for example, if somebody said, I need to walk to the other side of my office, but I cannot, I can't go forward. I can only go backwards, and I cannot go in a circle. I'm never getting there. You can give me 1 billion years and I'll never get to the other side of the office because I don't have a way to do that. And so that's the case for natural selection, because even just the term, when you hear that, it's selecting, it's not creating, it's selecting from things that are already there. And that can help organisms adapt and survive in different environments. But at the same time, like you said, it's taking away variety from that population. So sometimes organisms become so specialized for a particular environment that variety kind of goes away, that if the environment changes, they're at a disadvantage now because they don't have that variety in the population to be able to survive whatever's going on. And so sometimes that's why different populations die out. They're no longer around because they just can't deal with the changes that are happening.
Yeah, it's kind of like it does no good to have a car if you don't have a motor or gas. You're
Sure.
gonna need those
Yeah.
things to move it forward. Or if
Yeah.
your car, I actually had a car that was something wrong with the transmission that will only go backwards, and so I get a new vehicle.
Yeah. That won't get you anywhere.
Right. If you only go backwards, you're not really going forwards. You're not,
Right.
yeah. But evolution requires that it moves forward, that
Mhm.
it's a progression. And some people have come up with, I've noticed kind of a post hoc argument now that they know. They say, well, evolution doesn't really need to, you can lose like a body part or function and it still be considered evolution. And so some people will come up with like kind of like a post hoc argument now where they try to argue that the evolution allows you to lose information and still be considered evolution. What would you say to people that think it's okay to be losing those features and lizards lose the ability to make scales, but then gain the ability to make wings and for like for their views on that. But what would you say to that? Someone who
Yeah.
tried to argue that.
And I've heard that before, and I'm always just like, okay, but again, you can't just lose. How can you lose things and eventually get something new? All you're going to get, I would say, is something dead. You're not, you're not going to get something new because again, if you to go from a dinosaur to a bird, that's my favorite example to use because to me, that's one of the most ludicrous ideas in all of evolution. So if you, so let's say you lose the ability to form scales, or you lose the ability to be, whatever, to form certain teeth, or, whatever, that's fine. But at some point you have to gain something. You have to gain the ability to make feathers. You have to gain the ability to have very lightweight bones. You have to gain the ability to fly. You can't get to something else just by losing things. That's
Especially if
not going.
you're,
Oh, huh?
I was gonna say, especially if you're claiming that all life developed as a result of this
Right.
process.
Exactly. And I wanted to share a quote because this is a very because this whole thing with evolution, like it can just lose things and eventually be something else. And I think the evolutionists, they know that there's a problem with their mechanisms. They know because we can observe these things in the present. So it's not like we have to go back to the past and all. We can observe them in the present. And once in a while, I always say you'll get an honest paper that is very honest about their ideas and sees the problems in it. And there was a paper, it's several years ago now. I think it was, what year was it? 2010. And it was called a golden age for evolutionary genetics, genomic studies, and that's a question mark, genomic studies of adaptation in natural populations. And so it goes through all these great examples of how, like the stickleback fish and the loss of certain armor plating, and they talk about the blind cavefish and their pigmentation in their eyes, and they talk about butterflies. So all they're talking about is natural selection. I'm not talking about evolution because you're talking small variations within populations. You're not talking any dramatic changes. And of course they say, Well, if you give it enough time, it'll be fine, which it won't. But okay. So, but then they get to the very end of the paper because they realize, again, this is a problem for their idea. They even call it, I think one of the sections is entitled something like, the problems or something like that. But anyways, I'm going to read this quote. They said, of course, to some extent, the difference between loss and gain could be a question of semantics. Okay. So like the way that we say things. So for example, the loss of trichomes, which is a hair-like appendage on flies, could be called the gain of naked cuticle. So you're calling it basically the gain of loss. So you're saying it's gaining something by losing something. Now, here's the equivalent I always have on that, and to help people understand that. That's like saying if someone just lost all their money, all right? And the person says, I've not lost money, I've gained poverty. All right. Does it change your financial situation? No. You might sound more positive and more optimistic, but it doesn't change anything about your financial situation. You still have no money. So and really, when I read that quote, I like, wow, like it almost feels to me, and I don't know because I don't know the authors, like, are you trying to purposely deceive people? Because you're trying to because all you see is loss. So you're going to say, well, let's just say it a little differently, and that will help us. I don't know if that's just to make them feel better or to try to trick the public. I don't know, but it was pretty a bold statement, in my opinion, to say something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like an optimist, pessimist kind of thing. Like you see the glass half full or half empty,
Yeah.
but you're basically saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But but when it comes to gain and loss, those two are directly contradictory to each other. You can't gain by losing. All right.
Yeah.
We're making really good time. I hope you don't mind the follow-up questions. We're doing
You're
really
fine.
good on time at the moment.
Yeah.
Let's go to the question number 3. We skipped over that a second ago. Do mutations add any new information? We were on that subject matter, and you mentioned that gain and loss are not the same thing. Mutations. Do do you only? I know that mutations can mix the information around, scramble it, and it also causes a loss of information. I've actually heard the first time I heard this argument was that someone tried to say that duplication plus mutation and natural selection, equals evolution. And what would you say to someone who thinks that all they have to do is copy the information and then that's new information being added? I've heard people try to use that argument.
Yeah, that's a common argument. And I always say, how does that get you anything new? It doesn't get you anything new. Like if I have a book and I make a copy, I have 2 copies of the book, I don't have more information. I just have more of the same information. And for evolution, you need unique information. You need new information. You need something different with it. So that's one of the problems. The other thing is sometimes they'll say, well, that information gets duplicated, and then that duplicated information or whatever, that's where evolution can act on. It can tweak, it can change, if mutations occur there, then new activities, new functions can come about, while you still retain the other one, that's a good copy, so to speak, and all. But again, mutations don't do that. They don't tweak, they don't change things such that now it's producing new and improved unique proteins. Sometimes the mutations they might change, it might make a slightly different form of that protein, but the idea of it doing something new that it didn't do before, we just don't observe that. It's just, again, there's constraints, and even if, let's just say, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt that you can make mutations in this and make a completely new protein with a completely new function. Okay, I'll give you that. First of all, if you're going to go from a dinosaur to a bird, you're going to have a lot of those. Okay. So the odds of just having one of them is slim. Okay. And I would say infinitesimally slim. But let's just say you could get it. The problem is you don't just have to form a protein. You have to be able to regulate the production of that protein. That protein has to interact with 50 other proteins to do something new. Where are you going to get all those from? how are those going to evolve? How are you going to evolve the regulation so this protein that's doing this new thing is formed at the right place and the right time in the right tissues and right? I mean, there it's so much more complex than that, right? It's not just about forming these proteins, it's about regulating the production of those proteins, and proteins very rarely act just by themselves. They're not just these entities, they're interacting with lots of other things, so all those other things are going to have to evolve and change in order for those interactions to occur. So it's just kind of mind-boggling when you think about how complex it is and what are the odds that that would form by random chance over eons of time. And two, like a lot of times people will point to antibiotic resistance in bacteria. That is like one of the favorite icons of evolution. And they'll say, well, look, it gained the ability to resist being killed by this antibiotic. And I'll be like, okay, so first of all, that's true. Some of these bacteria will, antibiotic resistant bacteria are a real problem. And they are, gaining the ability to not be affected by a particular antibiotic. But then you have to look at how did they gain that ability? And when you look at the mutations that are there, in literally every case, it's due to the fact that they've lost the ability to produce a protein, or that particular protein is reduced in its functionality. So the normal function of that protein. So for example, bacteria that gain the ability to resist penicillin. Okay. Well, okay. So now though, they might have a problem. They might not be able to build a cell wall quite as well because again, the protein that penicillin normally interacts with has been changed. And so, yeah, now they're resistant, but they have problems doing other things. So in every single case, and the late Dr. Kevin Anderson actually wrote a paper on this, and he went down through all the different antibiotics and all the different ways that bacteria become resistant to them. In every single case, it's because of a loss of something, not because of a gain. And like we said before, you can't just keep losing things and get something new. At some point, you have to add things. And so it's just not an example of the ultimate gain that you need for evolution to occur.
Right. I actually have a couple quotes, if you don't mind. Are you familiar with Lee Spector, Dr. Lee
Yeah.
Spector? He wrote a book called Not by Chance, and he's actually a evolutionist. He's a theistic evolution, but he is not a Christian theistic evolutionist.
Right.
He's like Jewish. But he has problems with Neo-Darwinism, but he does believe in Darwinian evolution in some form. But and he's also one of the leading experts on point mutations. Is that correct?
Mhm. The good book. I've read it.
All right. On page 138, I got one that's a short quote and one's a long one. The long one is just
Okay.
a longer paragraph, but I just want to cite this real quick. Page 138 of his book, he says all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. I got one more. And the second one is on page 160 of his book. He says, not even one mutation that has been observed that adds a little information in the genome. That surely shows that they're not the millions upon millions of potential mutations the theory demands. There may well not be any. The failure to observe even one mutation that adds information is more than a failure to find support for the theory. It is evidence against the theory. We have a serious challenge to Neo-Darwinian theory. Now, on that, would you say you'd agree with Lee Spector? I mean, like you said, every now and then you'll find someone that's going to be honest about the data. And so he's saying that observably, we do not observe mutations that lose genetic information, and every one that has been studied has shown a loss of information. Would you agree to his comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because that book was written quite a few years ago now.
Right.
And so of course, people always think they have that sort of this will be the one that proves you wrong, this will be the mutation that proves you wrong. And as a geneticist, people throw those kind of papers at me all the time. And every time I've looked at one of those, it's not doing what it's resulting in a loss of information at some level. There is a loss going on. One of the examples, the nylon example in bacteria, it's been a while since I've seen that one come up, but it used to be really popular where they said that these bacteria, it was like a nylon waste product from like a factory. And so these bacteria gain the ability to break down nylon. And so that is a gain. Clearly, they gained that enzyme because nylon is obviously a synthetic product, a man-made product. So there's no way that that bacteria could have an enzyme to break that down. Not, where would that come from? But when you really look at it, again, how the bacteria did this, they break down a product very similar to nylon. And so with some mutations that happen in their DNA, they're able to utilize that same enzyme basically to now break down nylon. So again, that's fine. And bacteria are master adapters too. I think we have to be careful about using bacteria as examples of these things sometimes because the evolutionists need to be careful at least because they are very different organisms. They're single-celled organisms that God seems to have really designed with the ability to adapt. Well, you got to remember they can multiply themselves very quickly. If 10 million of them die and only a few survive and now have the ability to do something, that's fine. You don't have those same kinds of situations with like most organisms, especially with humans. And so, but again, they're using something they already had. It's an enzyme they already had that broke down something very similar, and now it's just gained mutation such that it can break this down too. That's not what you need to go from a dinosaur to a bird. That's not going to just tweaking, minorly tweaking what's already there. And another really popular one that people like to use is the work of Richard Linsky at Michigan State University. So he has these experiments, and I really appreciate Linsky's work. It's actually amazing. I think it's cool because he's had these what he calls long-term lines of E. coli that he's been growing in the lab continuously since 1988. So you're talking, it's probably reaching close to 100,000 generations now, which is amazing. And that's a cool, like, ongoing experiment. So as they do this experiment, they keep giving them more food, transferring them to a new dish. And so they just keep them going. They'll freeze down, they'll take out populations and test them and see what genetic changes are there. And so people will say, oh, look, that's an example of evolution. And I'm like, no, look at what has happened to these bacteria. When you look at their DNA, you will see that certain genes have been inactivated. They've lost certain proteins are no longer, the genetic information for them is no longer there, or they can at least produce the protein. They've lost certain regulatory controls. I always say they've gotten fat and lazy because they're living in a dish and you're giving them food, right? Which is a very abnormal situation for bacteria. Normally they're in the soil or somewhere, there's not a lot of nutrients. And so they jettison. So for example, E. coli normally produce flagella, and that's how they're able to move around. The ones in his experiments now don't produce flagella anymore. Well, they've lost the ability to do that. Why? Because they don't have to go anywhere for food, right? So once you get certain ones that have that, and they're no longer producing that, they live just as well as the ones that do. So over time, sometimes populations will drift or whatever, but over time they become more they just become more less fit, so to speak. So they're more fit to maybe live in the lab. But if you were to take those bacteria that have been in there for 75,000 generations and compare it to the original ones you started with, those original ones are going to have a lot more variability in their genome probably, and a lot more ability to survive in the outside world than the ones that are 75,000 generations out. So it really is and we have at least one paper on our website that I know goes into a lot of depth about that, looking at all the papers that Linsky has produced. And every time they say, well, this is clearly a gain, this is clearly evolution. And I'm like, no, it's a tweaking of something that they already possess. And now they use it in a slightly different way, but it's not ultimately the gain of genetic information you need to go to a different type of organism.
I just know that somebody, as soon as someone watches this interview, someone's going to come up with some sort of example of what they think
Sure.
is new information, and they're going to put it in the comment section, and it's really not new information at all.
No.
I heard someone said to bring up an enzyme that gets formed or some new version of enzyme or some new type of enzyme. I'm thinking, yeah, but that's the cell already can produce enzymes, so that's not really new.
Mm-mm.
It's not
Nope.
new information. It's not new instructions. It's
Mm-mm.
but all right, we're getting close to our time. Time moved fast on me. It's like 2 minutes still now. All right, let's get to question number 5. Do you have any additional thoughts pertaining to mutations or natural selection you wish to leave us with? Some
Yeah, I
additional
think
insight.
Yeah, I think it's just important for people not to be intimidated by them, as far as when they're touted as the, mechanisms for Darwinian evolution, and really think about, what these are things we can observe in the present. Okay, so look at what do the people that study mutations and natural selection, what are they really seeing? Like, are they seeing the types of changes, even if you gave it a long time, right? And even if you got a lot of these changes, would it really lead to a different organism? And that's just not what we're seeing. And we write about this all the time with Answers in Genesis. And so I just encourage people to think critically about that, because like they'll give the results in the paper. I mean, and you can see in like this one paper I was referencing earlier, okay, so butterflies have different coloring on their wings, but still the same colors. It's just variations in how those colors are placed, or they have less or more armor plates. Hey, that's not a different organism, so don't be fooled by that, I guess I would say. Really look at what are they finding, and does that support the idea of evolution?
Awesome. We're ending up here. Do you have any final thoughts to leave everyone with, or?
I don't think so. Just encourage people to come visit the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. I know the summer's coming up here, so it's a great time to visit. Well,
All
let's
right.
get, hey, do you when when this post on your show on
Channel.
YouTube,
Yeah.
can you send me a link to it and I will put it up on my social media?
Oh, awesome. Okay.
So,
That'd be
yeah,
great. Yes, I
yeah,
will. I will.
yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah,
All
no
right.
problem.
Well, that's it for today.
Okay,
And I thank you again, Dr. Purdom, for discussing this with us. I really, really appreciate it, and thank
sure.
you for being gung ho. I know I did some follow-up questions that wasn't on the
Yeah.
list of questions, but it's kind of hard to hear someone speak and not have some additional questions that
Oh
pop in.
yeah, you're fine.
All right,
Yep.
awesome. All right, I'll see you next time, and thank you again. All right,
Yep.
thank
All
you.
right. Sounds good.
All right, God
Thanks,
bless.
Ryan. Bye.
Bye. Thank you again for joining us on here on Apologetics 101 and the Genesis series. I had a great interview with Dr. Georgia Purdom. She's awesome. And we learned a lot on this. Mutations do not add new genetic information. Natural selection does not add new genetic information. In fact, they represent a loss of genetic information. And so I think that's crucial. I understand that they're going to be evolutionists that disagree with me, and there's going to probably be some evolutionists in the comment section that's going to give all kinds of examples of things they think are new information, and it's really not. Nothing that we've ever observed genetic information being added from natural processes through natural laws or any kind of naturalistic mechanism has ever produced new information. That includes mutations and natural selection. Neither one of those produce new information. They usually represent a loss of genetic information instead. And so that's what we end up observing. But anyway, this was awesome. I was so happy to do this discussion. We hit on some major points there that are crucial to this discussion and fundamental to understanding why evolution ultimately doesn't work. It doesn't matter how much time you give it, evolutionists. I know time is your magic ingredient, but it doesn't work. It does not work. All right. We'll see you again next time on Apologetics 101. Until then, stay in the know.